Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one is about Haggai.
When you turn the page, as you're reading straight through the Bible, from Zephaniah to Haggai, there is a mountain of change that occurs. And in order to understand where we are now and get oriented and wrap our heads around what Haggai is talking about, we're going to have to lay a little bit of groundwork here. All of these Old Testament prophets we've been reading up to this point are largely set in one of two eras. That is the mid-700s BC, right at the end of the northern kingdom of Israel, and all those prophets charge the northern kingdom with evil and corruption and wicked leadership and economic injustice, and they all anticipate Assyria coming along and conquering the northern kingdom, which happened under Sargon II in 722 BC. Then there's another flurry of Old Testament prophecy we've been looking at that is directed largely at the remaining southern kingdom of Judah that makes the same charges in the late 600s BC about corruption and evil and economic injustice. But these prophets are pointing toward this dark gathering storm on the horizon that is Babylon, and they correctly anticipate the destruction of the southern kingdom and the temple where God lives in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians. But then we turn the page over to Haggai, and everything looks different. For starters, the layout of the text looks different. It's going to look in your Bible more like the block formatting of Genesis or Exodus, like narrative, the way it's presented. Whereas all of the prophets we've been looking at up till this point, mostly it looks like the way Psalms is laid out. It's poetry, or at least a poetic structure in the way these prophecies are given. Further, we discovered that we've fast-forwarded almost 100 years since what we were looking at with Zephaniah, all the way past the era of the Babylonians and into the early era of the Persians. So a whole empire has fallen in between. Babylon is gone, deposed by Cyrus the Great and Persia. And if we go back and look at Ezra and Nehemiah, we can piece things together. Also, we can go back and just look at history books, because now we're into the stuff that's really well documented extra biblically. And we can see that Cyrus the Great conquered the Babylonians in 539. And then in 538, he's like, yeah, we're not going to rule like the Assyrians and the Babylonians. We're going to let some of these conquered people groups go back, rebuild their home countries, and have a degree of self-governance, still subject to Persia, of course. That, mixed with violent expansion, is how Cyrus built up the Persian Empire so quickly. But Cyrus just couldn't get enough of conquering things, and he died at the hands of a warrior queen in the far north, and that created a little bit of a succession crisis in early Persia. His son, Cambyses, was given the kingdom. He had military success in Egypt, but then he dies as a young man, getting on his horse and scraping himself with his own weapon. And his kid brother in the east is about to find out and no doubt claim power. But there's an opportunity right here, and Cambyses' lance bearer, the guy who's in charge of making sure he doesn't get stabbed with his own weapons, a young man named Darius, along with a few other guys, are like, we got to take control of the situation. We have to pounce now. So they ride hard from the far west all the way across the kingdom back to the Persian homeland, and they catch Bardia and they assassinate him. Well, they come out and tell the world it wasn't Bardia at all. It was a magician impersonating Bardia, and we purged the kingdom for all of you citizens of this evil usurper, and it is with a heavy heart that I, Darius, will become the new king. Now, while all of this stuff is going on, the Jewish exiles have returned under the leadership of a couple of guys named Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, who would be king if there were still a kingdom, and a high priest named Joshua, and they've been chipping away at rebuilding the temple. That's a little bit of a bummer so far because they can't afford a great big giant temple. The footprint is going to be smaller, and there's been opposition, and they've lost momentum. In fact, the building has completely stalled out during the age of Cambyses and the early age of Darius. But very quickly, through a Persian official, the Jews send an appeal back to Darius and are like, hey, we were commissioned by Cyrus to do this. It's funded. And Darius is like, all right, let me rummage through the records. Yep, sure enough, there it is. Darius is very politically motivated to make sure that all edicts of previous kings are honored. And in 520, he gives the Jews permission to start building again. This is where things get weird, and this is where Haggai comes in and is so necessary in this exact moment in history. And I think it's so important to note that in Haggai, we get specific dates for when all of Haggai's prophecy occurs. In fact, I'll just tell you. The first one happened on August 20th, 520. The second one, September 1st, 520. The third one, October 17th, 520. And then he had two in the same day, maybe one over breakfast and one over dinner on December 18th, 520. This is the first place in the Bible where we get unbelievable date specificity. And it makes so much sense because we also have unbelievable date specificity as to what's going on in the larger world. And when we compare the two, we understand Haggai's urgent call to get cracking on rebuilding the temple. He does not view this rebuilding project as a foregone conclusion. Rather, he views it as something that needs to be happening right now. Why? Darius's claim to the throne was weak. There were people who liked the family of Cyrus, and they rebelled. There were other parts of the Persian Empire on the far fringes who were like, without Cyrus and his family, I don't think this Persia thing is going to hold up. We're just going to go back to governing ourselves. So Darius, in the fall of 520, is preparing for a massive campaign of reassimilation that he goes on starting in early 519, and there's no guarantee he's going to win. Well, the only reason the temple is being funded and rebuilt is because Darius feels pressure to uphold the edicts of previous kings. If Darius dies, if Darius's control of the region shrinks, if his campaign to reassimilate everyone and firm up his control over things drains the treasury enough, then he might not want to fund this thing anymore. And so Haggai is going, let's get cracking, read the room, guys. So his whole play is to shake everybody out of complacency. Haggai's message is pretty straightforward. On August 20th, 520, he looks at what's going on. He's like, why are you guys building cool, fancy, paneled houses, maybe in the style of Persia, for yourselves while God is still homeless? And he seems to be intoning, if you get the building order wrong, if you come at this the wrong way, it undermines the effectiveness and the purity of the temple that you're eventually, I guess, planning to get around to build. No, you need to be taking care of God's house first. And by September 21st, under the leadership of Zerubbabel, that is happening. Things are moving. In the midst of all of that, Haggai is communicating that God's Spirit remains in your midst. God is with you. He doesn't live in that temple anymore right now, but like the imagery we've seen in some of the other minor prophets, he's dwelling among you, and he is behind this thing. I mean, specifically, the language is saying, work, for I am with you. And we've heard God say stuff like this before, like back in Exodus, we get this kind of language. While God's people are in the shadow of another giant empire, we get this kind of language sometimes when God's people go into battle during the era of the conquest, even sometimes in the age of the kings. So this is a massively encouraging word from Haggai to say, hey, it might not look like the glory of the last temple, but Haggai goes on to say, the glory of this thing somehow is going to exceed that of the previous temple, and God is already in our midst. And as an additional encouragement, we see Haggai drawing on the same imagery that we get in Isaiah and in Micah chapter 4 about all the nations coming to worship at this building that they are building right now. He says in verse 7 of chapter 2, and I will shake all nations so that the treasures of all nations shall come in, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord of hosts. So there's an urgency here that goes beyond the momentary political unpredictability that Darius and the larger kingdom is going through here. There's an urgency because Haggai is reminding them this is to be a blessing to the nations. This is not a regional deity being appeased by his regional ethnic followers. This is an act of service to all of humanity that you guys are doing. You are playing a role in the grand story of redemption for everybody, so make it happen. Then finally, on December 18th, 520, Haggai speaks again a couple of times, And one of those, he reiterates the idea that you need to do this right and with purity and pure hearts, so that what you are building will be built on a foundation of doing things right with purity and pure hearts. And then he goes on to talk about that idea of the day of the Lord again, like what we saw in Joel, this concept that the nations are going to be judged. That's a follow-up on all the stuff that the prophets back in the age of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were saying. And finally, he says to Zerubbabel in so many words that there's going to be a restoration of David's royal line. And of course, he's saying that to Zerubbabel because Zerubbabel is a part of David's royal line. I love the way extra-biblical history and the stuff that we see Haggai saying overlap and intertwine so neatly. It just makes the book that much more understandable. But I also love the fact that Haggai is very optimistic about the role that people play in the unfolding of God's plan, and the fact that God has ordained that people get to take part in this and that it actually matters. When you visualize the book of Haggai, picture those paneled houses that everybody was building because they were so eager to have a fancy house and had gotten bored of building a house for God. When you think about the theme, reflect on restoring God's dwelling place as a part of the grand story of redemption. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, which you probably do have time to read the whole thing, it goes pretty quick, at least make sure to check out chapter 1, verse 13, and chapter 2, verses 20 through the end of the chapter. This was a tough one for me. There was so much more stuff that I wanted to do and that I wanted to get into with the Persia business. If that whetted your appetite and you find that stuff fascinating as well, please plan to stick with me when we get done with this series, because we are going to deep dive into the book of Esther and all of this Persia exile historical stuff. And I think it's going to be a ton of fun. That's coming up, really in just a few weeks at this point. There we go. We have unlocked the Haggai achievement, and we've got one of the granddaddies of Old Testament prophecy next, Zechariah, which is just wonderful. Can't wait. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.